What's going on, everyone? It's Dungeon here, and today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my early game sorcery guide for Dark Souls 3. So if you're tired of the old hack and slash and you want to feel the ultimate power of magic, you've come to the right place. Let's get right on into it. Alright, if you're wondering what this guide is all about, I just have to mention that sorceries really isn't as simple as what is the best weapon, the best catalyst, or spell, but rather it is a combination of everything. It's the entire build. So, with that being said, this guide includes the early game tips on statistics, weapons, catalysts, spells, and gear. All that stuff, and how it all works together too, alright? So, the first thing you gotta know is that intelligence is the primary statistic governing sorcery damage. The other stat that you really should worry about, aside from vigor of course, is attunement, because that's going to determine how much FP that you have, that's focus points, that you have for your spells, as well as how many spell slots that you have. Basically, what that means for early game is that you'll want to have your attunement probably somewhere either 18 or 24, not necessarily in between, so that you can get the extra spell slot. And you'll want your intelligence probably all the way up to 40 as early as you can. Consequently, that means pretty much everything else is going to take a back seat, and that includes vigor. While you may want to get it to the soft cap of 27 for some extra hit points, you're probably going to just have to let it be somewhere between 15 and 20 so that you can bump up the attunement and intelligence to what it needs to be. Now, the other thing I got to mention is that you may want to spare some points so that you can put a few points into strength or dex so that you can use a weapon that I'm about to mention. Lastly, just know that you'll want to get your intelligence eventually to 60 and your attunement eventually to probably 30 or 40 by the end of the game. When we're talking about early game weapons, the first thing you need to consider with a mage build is stat requirements. Most of the time, you're only really going to be considering weapons that have low requirements, specifically in strength, because starting out as a sorcerer, your strength is only a 7, but your dex is 12. However, with minimal amount of stat investment, it actually does open a wide selection of really good weapons. First off, if you're looking for a straight sword, all you have to do is get your strength up to a 10, and you'll be able to choose between a long sword or broadsword, both of which in general, they're really good weapons, but they also work really well with elemental infusions, specifically the crystal infusion, which would be a boon for your high intelligence. But early on, the fire infusion works particularly well, especially if you start out with a fire gem as a starting gift. If you're looking for an axe, I would recommend the hand axe, which you can get from the Undead Settlement, and it has pretty minimal stat investment too, and it works really well with elemental infusions, particularly fire. But you could also go with a thrall axe if you manage to be lucky enough to get one to drop from one of the thralls in the Undead Settlement. In the early game, the thrall axe works really well with different types of infusions, but it's actually particularly good in the later game when you put a simple gem into it. Just keep in mind that it doesn't have the war cry weapon art, but instead has the potentially more advantageous quick step. That being said, you can always opt to go for a deep battle axe or crystal brigand axe, but do keep in mind you'll have to invest even more strength into your character. The rapier is one of the lowest stat requirement weapons on my list, and it's actually a fantastic weapon that does a tremendous amount of critical damage. But if you're looking for a weapon, thrusting sword that is, that has a better moveset, slightly more base damage, just not as much critical damage, you'll definitely want to change that out for the S stock once Grey Rat pillages the Undead Settlement. You can decide to infuse these with crystal, raw, or in some cases you may not infuse them with anything at all. And what you'll want to do is just take a look at the damage before you commit to infusing either of them. You could potentially consider the curved swords too. It may only take a little bit of stat investments to use the falchion. Particularly, I think you have to put 1 point into dexterity. But it could be well worth it because the falchion is well known for its stun locking potential. However, in the making of this video, I have to be honest, I have really come to love the scimitar, whereas I would recommend some sort of elemental infusion for the falchion, preferably crystal of course. I'm actually going to recommend you would go with raw infusion for the scimitar and then also just cast a magic weapon or great magic weapon spell or whatever on it because it's so fast. You'll be able to get more damage in actually. People in the mage build will a lot of times overlook the value of strike weapons, especially as a sorcerer. There actually are a couple options. First thing you have to consider is using a raw club. It may not seem like a great idea, but I assure you it's a really good weapon, especially in the early game. Another option you can do if you're willing to put just a little bit more strength into your character. I think you need a 12 strength to use the mace, but if you do, it does more damage than the club, like considerably more when you infuse it with raw. And the thing about raw infusions is that your physical stats actually won't matter, and then what you'll want to do is just buff it with magic weapon, and then you'll still be able to get a considerable amount of strike damage, which is really good against armored enemies. Lastly, if you're willing to put a lot of stat investment into strength and or dexterity, then I wholeheartedly recommend the Astora Greatsword from the Cathedral of the Deep Graveyard. Put a crystal gem in this sucker and it is going to really perform for you. Also, you could opt for the Claymore from the High Wall, and even, dare I say, the Sellsword Windblades from the Road of Sacrifices. Now, you can get the Sellsword Windblades as a starting item for, I believe it's the Sellsword class. But that being said, you can do really well with infusing the, as I said, the Astora Greatsword and even the Claymore with the crystal infusion. Just make sure that you leave the Sellsword Windblades raw and then buff them with a magic weapon spell. I am really excited to talk about these catalysts because most people think there's really like one option, maybe two options throughout the whole game, but there's really a few. Now the first option for the early game that most people consider using is the Sorcerer's Staff. Basically you get that starting out as a sorcerer, or you could buy it from the Shrine Handmaid. And most people will use this until later on in the game when they get the Court Sorcerer's Staff, which is a totally fine path. But for the early game, I want to mention that there are a few other choices of catalysts that you can use from, and some of them will probably impress you. So, the first option, other than obviously the Sorcerer's Staff, for the early game that I want you to consider is the Heretic Staff from the Road of Sacrifices. This thing is basically the same as the Sorcerer's Staff. It even has the same weapon art, but it has a higher spell buff than the Sorcerer's Staff throughout the majority of the game. In fact, it starts out with a 120 spell buff power compared to 100 that the Sorcerer's Staff has. It is only overtaken in spell buff power by the Sorcerer's Staff when you reach intelligence to upwards almost 50. And even then, the difference is between 1 and 5 depending on your intelligence. However, by that time in the game, you're probably going to be switching it out for a later game catalyst like the Court Sorcerer's Staff. So, the second option that I want you guys to consider is the Storyteller Staff. Now, look, the spell buff on the Storyteller Staff is really comparable to the sorcerer staff. Like it's really a lot alike. And like I said, once you get up into the higher intelligences, then they're pretty much all three of these that I'm mentioning. They're really close actually. But the storyteller staff is a little less. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this, because you're like, well, why would you even use it if it's not as good? Well, it's good in other ways. You see, it doesn't have the weapon art that the other two do. It doesn't buff the catalyst when you use the weapon art because the weapon art for the storyteller staff produces poison. And actually, this is the best poison in the entire game. There are bosses that you can almost completely erase if you apply the poison to them. And if you're interested to try this out, basically all you gotta do is get it as a random drop from the Corvian spellcasters on the road to sacrifices. Now, if you think it'd be cool to have a weapon that can actually be used to cast spells like a catalyst, then you really ought to give the Hazel Pick a try. You get this from the NPC Invader at the Road to Sacrifice Swamp, but as mentioned, it doubles as a weapon and a catalyst, so there's no need for switching between a shield and something else. You could just have that shield out, or something else in your other hand if you want it. And as a bonus, it's got really good stun locking potential. Alright, hear me out on this last one because you're probably not going to like to hear this, but you may want to give the Cleric Candlestick a try for certain builds. Now, as a few caveats, you do have to have a little bit of faith already invested in your character, and if you are maybe even a little bit considering taking Deep Soul, the spell Deep Soul, which is, by the way, an awesome spell, then I would just say forget about the Cleric Candlestick, just stay clear of it. And if you're looking for a weapon that duels as a catalyst, just stick with the Hazel Pick. But if you're willing to give it a shot, it does function as a straight sword, so it's got a better moveset than the Hazel Pick, but it has a worse weapon art. Also, it does pretty comparable damage, so maybe give it a try. As far as spells go, starting out as a sorcerer will give you two main spells to use, Soul Arrow and Heavy Soul Arrow. Both are good, but Soul Arrow is pretty much better because it doesn't take so long to cast, even though Heavy Soul Arrow does more damage. You'll be using Soul Arrow more. As you get further along in the game, you will unlock Great Soul Arrow and Great Heavy Soul Arrow from Orbeck, which are both fantastic spells as damage upgrades to the original versions. Some of you may not want to use any melee weapons at all, and for those of you out there who are going for that type of build, there's basically two options for you, the Fair and Flash Sword and Soul Greatsword. While both are good, I would invest in the Fair and Flash Sword because it's quick and it's got great reach and it's just awesome. A quick tip about it is that not all catalysts have the same reach with the Fair and Flash Sword. For instance, the Storyteller Staff has a much greater reach than the other catalysts that I've mentioned so far. And if you're close enough to the target, your catalyst will do a little bit of extra damage from the catalyst in addition to the spell damage, which is actually particularly good when combined with frostbite effects and the immolation tinder in the later game. I've already talked about magic weapon spell, and it's definitely a bread and butter for those of you who are playing with a melee weapon that is either not infused at all or infused with raw, sharp, heavy infusions or something like that. So long as you can still buff the weapon, you'll definitely want to get this spell or one of its upgrades. For those of you assassins out there, make sure that you grab the Hidden Body and Spook spells that allow you to move silently and hidden around levels totally undetected. Just know that there is a ring that can do some of these actions too. Many of you will want to have a spell that provides a dark damage option, and for that I would highly recommend that you check a look at the Deep Soul spell. You'll get it from transposing the soul of the Deacons of the Deep, and I've got to say that it's a really fantastic spell because of how much stopping power that it has, as well as how little FP that it uses to cast. And while the damage might seem a little low, it's actually pretty good considering the amount of FP that it actually uses. As an interesting note, the projectile moves a little bit slowly, which isn't entirely a bad thing because it's got really good tracking. I would say that it might be worth using this against some bosses in particular. Alright? Alright, don't crucify me on this one, but lastly, I've got to talk about Pestilent Mist. It has a higher intelligence requirement of 30, and it is a little bit of a cheese spell. But if you're looking for an easier way to take down some of certain bosses, you may want to give this one a try. Alright, that's all I'm going to say. Okay, there are a number of pieces of equipment that you'll want to check out for your playthrough as a sorcerer in the early game, and they are as follows. So first off, you have the Young Dragon Ring, which provides a 12% damage boost to all sorceries cast while wearing it. The Crown of Dusk is a headpiece that you can put on that will provide you a 10% damage boost to all magic damage that you deal. The Lingering Dragon Crest Ring provides a 30% extension onto the spell durations on any kind of spells that you use that provides duration. The Sage Ring provides a plus 30 dexterity bonus for the purposes only of spellcasting speed, so it doesn't provide any other bonuses besides spellcasting speed, which has a limit of 50 dex. The Saint and Deep Ring provides a plus 1 spell slot bonus, and you can actually stack both. The Lloyd Sword Ring provides a plus 10% damage bonus, and that's all damage as long as you have full HP. And last but not least, the Slumbering Dragon Crest Ring actually will make you silent. So very similar to the Spook spell in a ring. Okay, so with all these choices, you're basically going to have to make some judgment calls considering your build and how you're going to try to get your DPS as high as possible. In which case, you'll want to maximize your damage buffs through your choices of equipment. However, I will say that certain items could be a little bit more advantageous than straight damage buffs in certain situations. So, you know, it really is a judgment call based on whatever you want to do for your build. But for those of you who are trying to get the Slumbering Dragon Crest Ring, what you have to do is buy the spells Fair and Flash Sword, Pestilent Mist, Hidden Body, Spook, and Aural Decoy, however you want to say it, from Orbeck, and then talk to him and he'll just give it to you. So the rest of the items that on the list are pretty much easy enough to attain with a normal playthrough. I did want to mention a little side note for those of you who want faster casting speed, but you also want to free up another ring slot. You could use the Saintry Belvine Miracle Chime that you get just outside of the Cathedral of the Deep. All you have to do is hold it in the offhand and it'll allow you to cast with the fastest casting speed. So, of course, it's up to you if you even want to consider doing that. For those of you who've made it this far in the video, I just want to say thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. And I want you to know these videos take a long time to put together. So it'd be super awesome if you could hit that like button for me if you do like what you see. Otherwise, thanks again, everyone. So I haven't really talked about shields or equipment load, and they kind of go hand in hand because if you want to use a shield, more than likely your weight ratio is going to be hopefully between 40 and 70%. Just as long as you keep it under 70%, you won't be fat rolling and you can use your shield to block attacks. Conversely, if you want to go with a light equip load, keep it under 30% to get that fast roll. However, this means that you're probably not going to be able to use a shield because it weighs too much, so you'll be dodging out of the way of attacks instead. Fortunately, you have the much better dodge roll that actually rolls farther, so the choice is up to you. Both are good options. While the shield may be easier in some respects, having the light equip load and the fast dodge roll is actually super fun and rewarding. Alright, you guys, that concludes my early game sorcery guide. And for those of you who didn't see your favorite early game sorcery tip or spell, shout out to the Fair and Hail and Homing Soul Mass spells. Tell us which ones you use in the comments down below. If you had fun, if you learned something, if you enjoyed watching this, hit that like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon so you don't miss another video. And as always, thanks. Stay cool, and bye everyone.